recap. What are the structures? So now this is in the inner ear, the internal ear. What is the structure that's responsible for hearing, picking up different frequency sounds? Cochlea, right? And it's that structure right here. And then we didn't really talk about this a whole lot. I just kind of breezed over it. But the structure that's responsible for balance or vestibular sense. What part of the internal ear is involved in that? So it's all this other stuff, not the cochlea, but the vestibular apparatus. So it's the vestibule, and it's these three semicircular canals that are right here. And we'll talk a lot more about those in physiology, but for now, let's just say part of the bony labyrinth. This is all the bony labyrinth. Have you guys seen The Never-Ending Story? It's kind of a long time ago. They redid it. Anyways, there's a big labyrinth in there. It's a big puzzle maze that the little boy has to like figure out. This is like this really complex sort of puzzle or maze that's in the internal ear. So it's called the bony labyrinth. This portion right here is part of your vestibular sense or equilibrium. Basically, it gives information. There's fluid in here and there's little structures in here, sort of positioned right here and right here. They're called the macula. And then there's these little structures right at the base of each of these coils or these semicircular canals. So right there, there, and there. And they're attached to neurons that go to the vestibular part of the vestibular cochlear nerve. And when that fluid moves around in there in different directions, basically when you're moving your head in a linear direction or the linear position of the head, whether it's up or down or there's acceleration, that movement is sort of detected in this vestibule because there's hair cells of different type that are embedded in there. And when the gelatin sort of material around them pulls or goes in different directions, that activates those neurons and tells your brain your position of your head or linear movement of the head. When you move your head or your body in different directions, like spinning, so when you somersault or you move laterally, you make sort of turns in the body, like if some of you are a couple of you dance, did a couple of you dancers, right? And you spin your head. When you're spinning, that fluid in there is circulating and moving, right? So it activates the base of those semicircular canals. That gives your brain information on rotational acceleration, okay? So these linear and rotational sort of movement of the head, that's what allows you to take in sort of equilibrium information. So equilibrium or vestibular sense is all conducted by the semicircular canals, okay, the ducts that are running through them, the fluid that's running through them, and the vestibular apparatus, or the vestibule. Hearing is all cochlea. Okay, so what is the nerve that combines those two senses of balance and hearing? What particular cranial nerve brings in that information to the brain? Do you remember? It has the two names of those special senses right in it. Vestibulocochlear nerve, cranial nerve 8. That's Victor. Remember, mnemonic? Okay, that's Victor. Cranial nerve 8. And that is this whole, all the neurons that come from the vestibule, that come from the base of the semicircular canals. These are actually called crista ampullaris, these little structures that are in here. All that information goes in the vestibular part of cranial nerve 8. The hearing information that comes from higher frequency to lower frequencies in the audible human hearing range, those actually synapse on axons that are going back through the cochlear portion of that nerve. So this is like a 2-for-1 nerve. Both of those special senses come in and send that information to the brain through cranial nerve 8. Okay, so that's kind of a recap. That's a lot of the stuff we talked about. Is there a question? No? Okay. I didn't really, I kind of went over this quickly, so let me come back to it. There's two types of overall deafness: conduction deafness, sensory neural deafness. The way I think of sensory neural is this is any part of the pathway, so the neural pathway from the nerve, vestibulocochlear nerve, to the brain, or parts of the brain that process audition, that would be sensory neural deafness, okay? Conduction deafness, and a lot of times this is more common, this results from sound not being able to conduct the right way through the apparatus and then make it to the nerve and make it to the brain, okay? So ruptured tympanic membrane eardrum, otosclerosis. Oftentimes even there's fluid or wax or material buildup in there due to infection or other reasons, and that can cause conduction deafness. In physiology lab, we're actually going to measure things like visual acuity, astigmatism, color blindness, and believe it or not, we usually have somebody that it's not truly blindness, it's color deficiency. Usually they're lacking one of the colored cones, so they can't perceive the whole range of colors the way someone that's a trichromat, has the 3 color pigments, can. And it's more common in men than it is in women, and it's about anywhere from 1% or a little more than 1% of males will have color blindness because it's carried on the X chromosome. So we'll detect that when we do lab in physiology. And we'll look at conduction deafness versus sensory neural. There's a whole bunch of auditory tests that we can do to figure out or to sort of measure these 2 different types of hearing loss. Also sensory neural, this is one I mentioned, spinal meningitis can affect this and can cause deafness and even blindness, right? Because it affects the nerve and the brain. It's basically attacking sort of the meninges that surround and protect the brain and the spinal cord. So that can result in sensory neural deafness. Okay, and then we talked about cochlear implants and all of that. Yes, Rachel?
Which one is you're born with? Or it can be
Usually it's sensory neural.
Okay.
It can be congenital defects that can affect the conduction pathways. So there's something that's not right in the bones or the eardrum or the canal of the ear, but that's not as common as sort of sensory neural loss of hearing. Congenital, so that you're born with. Yeah. All right, let's see. I will pull up next set. So we're going onto the heart and the cardiovascular system. So this is really cardiovascular / circulatory system. Putting it all together in this lecture series. These slides are up. I'm going to plug this back in. Okay. Here we go. Hopefully it comes back up. Okay. Yes, okay. So this is cardiovascular, and then circulatory, meaning we get a little bit into the blood and the blood vessels. All right. So outline, this is sort of what we're going to focus on here. Pulmonary and systemic circuits, talking about circulation in the cardiovascular system. Heart structure, current research highlight just a little bit. Conduction system of the heart, how does the heart actually conduct and beat? How does it actually fires action potentials and allows it to continue beating. The cardiac cycle, we'll go over that briefly, and we'll spend more time in physiology going over that. And then some clinical implications of heart. Then we'll go over blood vessels, and some disorders and diseases that are part of the circulatory and cardiovascular system. And then, of course, always at the end, I like to look at the effects of aging and exercise, because those things are highly relevant when we talk about these organ systems. So the heart is really an amazing piece of machinery. It's like we focused on the eyeball, and I said it's pretty amazing architecture. It's set up, it does really well what it's supposed to do. The heart is sort of the same way. And this is kind of cheesy, but I'm just saying, it's not where you really keep your emotions. You know, people say, oh, at the bottom of my heart, I love you with all my heart. Really, that's in your brain, right? So a lot of that is your cortex, your cerebral cortex, and deeper areas of your cerebrum. But it's a really vital organ of your body, and it's really what keeps you alive, right? So it's the pump that allows all the blood to circulate throughout your body and reach all the tissues, all the organs, and make sure they get oxygen and nutrients, and then remove waste. So if we look at development of the heart, when it develops and how it develops in humans, the heart actually starting to fold in the thorax region about day 20 to day 21. So sort of right about here, it's actually folding. It's kind of a two tubes side by side. They're two vessels that sort of have a swelling at part of them. They're fused, they fuse right next to each other, so there's kind of sort of swollen vessels. They fuse together and they have sort of this upper swollen part and the lower sort of swelling. And then now they're completely fused and they start to fold. They fold in a very distinct sort of pattern to make up ultimately the atria and the ventricles of the heart and the major vessels that actually leave the heart of the major arteries. So the heart actually already starts pumping by day 22. Okay, so day 22, it's already starting to pump. The little ventricles and atria are already squeezing and pumping blood throughout the circulation. So it's really in its near final form by day 35. So just over a month. This is after fertilization, right? So early development, and we looked at all those sort of sequences of early development. About day 35, it's in its near final form, and it actually can be and pump blood. And you can see it on an ultrasound. So before that, before about the first month, anywhere from somewhere around 28 days, 35 days in between there, you can start seeing it beat. But before that, there's no actual beating. It's forming. It's taking its sort of overall anatomical form. So people, medical professionals, like if you are pregnant and you go to an OB and you want to do an ultrasound, if you're less than a month pregnant, like 2 weeks along, a week along, they won't really do an ultrasound because there's not going to be a heart beating at that point. And so it's not going to give you, that gives a lot of information about viability of the embryo, right? So they wait till the time frame is good, you'll do urine pregnancy tests and all kinds of other things, but you're not going to be able to see a heart beating until after month 1. But it's still pretty amazing that it's already there in near final form that early, right? It's pretty, it gets constructed and it's all there. So it starts as this earliest heart chambers are basically unpaired. So they're just kind of swelling here, the two fuse together. And then they're actually separated into the atria and into the ventricles. Blood travels a little bit different route than in the adult. So the traveling of the blood and how it leaves the heart and then how it enters the heart, it's actually a little bit different. And there's even a connection between the atria, this foramen ovale, and this ductus arteriosus, this little duct that connects the great vessels leading the heart and then connects the two atria. There's holes. So the blood actually can go back and forth. In all of you, there is no holes or no duct. This blood is completely separate, okay? And the reason for this is the heart, very closely in combination with the respiratory system, is picking up what? What is critical that it needs to pick up and travel throughout the body? Oxygen, right? So in this situation, where is the baby or the embryonic heart getting the oxygen? The mom, right? The placenta, the mom. So arteries, umbilical arteries and veins go to the placenta. The placenta is the structure that's both maternal and baby sort of embryonic structures. And there's an exchange of oxygen and nutrients and waste. So the fetal heart is not sending through the pulmonary arteries blood to the lungs to pick up oxygen because the lungs aren't working. It's sending it, actually just merging it with, sending it out so it can pick up blood from the placenta from mom and then come back. So it pretty much is bypassing the lungs to pick up oxygen, just sending oxygenated blood to the lungs. The lungs are not functional yet, it's in water, okay, right? The embryo and then fetus developing is in water. So these two structures are very different in the embryonic and fetal heart versus the newborn baby child in all of you. That closes, that hole closes, and that duct pinches off and sort of becomes just a little ligament. It's gone. Because you want to keep the blood separate, and we'll look at how those circuits flow and how the blood is kept separate in the adult heart. So there's some differences between the embryonic and the adult heart because of where the blood is picking up oxygen. So the heart is a muscular double pump. That's what we refer to it as. It's a double pump. And it also has a couple different circuits. It's got the pulmonary circuit, and we're talking now about in a child or in an adult, not in embryonic development, right? Because that has that different pathway of blood that goes to placenta. So the pulmonary circuit, like in all of you, it takes blood to and from the lungs. It's simple, that's all it is. Pulmonary circuit, it goes from heart to the lungs, from the lungs back to the heart. Your lungs are working, they're respiring, you're inhaling, you're exhaling. It's picking up by diffusion the oxygen and getting rid of the CO2 every time blood perfuses to the lungs. Okay, so that's the circuit we call it. The systemic circuit, anytime in anatomy or physiology you hear systemic, that means it's involving the systems of the body, right? It goes out to your different organ systems. It's taking the body circuit. Vessels transport the blood to and from the body tissues. Atria get blood from the pulmonary and systemic circuits. Okay, so returning blood goes to the atria, the top heart chambers. The ventricles those are the muscular pumping chambers, receive blood from the atria. So really it's a double pump. It's atria and it's ventricles. And the ventricles are the ones that do the big pumping action, really get the blood out to the pulmonary circuit and to the systemic circuit. So if we look at those two circuits, and this is drawn not to scale, just kind of diagrammatically. Here's the heart. It's got the upper chambers, the atria. It's got the lower chambers, the ventricles. And it sends blood out the right ventricle, up the vessel, which we'll look at later, is the pulmonary trunk, and the pulmonary arteries. There's actually two of them, and they go off each side. This is just keeping it simple for a diagram. But the blood leaving the pulmonary circuit, or the pulmonary trunk, goes up, goes to the lungs, gives rise to all the teeny tiny capillaries that surround the air sacs in the lungs, so in the alveoli. Those capillaries are positioned right there. They pick up by diffusion all the oxygen and get rid of the CO2. They get oxygenated, so now it's red. Hemoglobin actually changes its color when it gets sort of oxidized, when it carries oxygen versus when it drops the oxygen. Even a small shift in that looks more of a purplish blue, the deeper color versus a dark red. Now it's oxygenated, comes back, returns to the left side of the heart, dumps into the left atrium. That completes the pulmonary circuit. Systemic circuit is getting blood that's deoxygenated from the head, from the neck, from the body, letting it go through the heart. So here we have systemic circuit, deoxygenated. All the organ systems and tissues and cells have used a lot of oxygen. The venous blood returns to the heart, the right atrium, okay, through the vena cava. We'll look at the superior vena cava, the inferior vena cava, they're keeping it simple. Goes into the right atrium, goes down into the right ventricle, and then in this part it actually goes, this is the part that goes to the lungs to pick up oxygen. The other side of that systemic circuit is getting the oxygenated blood to go out to the body, and that is from the lungs you get the oxygenated blood, it goes left atrium, left ventricle, out the major artery, which is the aorta. This actually splits off and goes out to the head, and it goes out to the rest of the body, so it goes to the head, neck, body, delivers that oxygenated blood to all the tissues of the body. So the whole sort of systemic circuit is getting oxygen out to the head and tissues, and then getting that deoxygenated blood back to the heart. The heart is the one that then sends it to the lungs to do the whole cycle all over again. So you need the pulmonary circuit to get the oxygenated blood. And then the systemic circuit is how you get that blood out to the head and the tissues, okay? So we're gonna go over the different parts of the heart and the different vessels that actually do both of those circuits of the body. Okay, location within the thorax. So we're just gonna get sort of the geography of sort of where the heart is, its overall shape. A lot of people think the heart is kind of the size of your fist. That's not really true, it's actually bigger than that. But when you're young, when you're little, it's about the size of your fist. And then it grows bigger as you grow older. And I think it's like off to the left. It's not, it's really kind of in the midline, and it's just tilted and kind of sitting back. So it apex points off to the left. Typical heart weighs about 250 to 350 grams, depending on size. That's a healthy heart. It's the largest organ of the mediastinum. Remember, the mediastinum is that central thorax cavity. You've got the pleural cavities and the mediastinal cavity. So it's located between the lungs. It's got an apex and it's got a base. Apex of the heart is sort of the pointed part of the heart that encompasses the ventricles, the bottom part. So the heart is kind of sitting behind the sternum, right? The manubrium, body of the sternum, xiphoid process, that helps to shield or protect the heart because it's vital. Lungs and heart are very vital. The heart is sitting behind the sternum, angled back with the apex sort of tilted forward and slanted to the left. So that's sort of the overall position of the heart in the chest. So if we look at it, it's kind of right in the midline. We call this the mid-sternal line. And the apex is kind of shifted off to the left, and it's sitting back. So it's almost, here's the base, and here's the apex. It's like it's sitting back and just kind of tilted just like that, okay? But for the most part, it is centrally positioned in the midline, the mid-sternal line. Here's the diaphragm, so it's sitting on top of the diaphragm, and it's in basically this mediastinal cavity, or the mediastinum right here, and it has a pericardial sac that surrounds it. Remember, we talked about the pleural cavities and the pleura, or the sac surrounding the lungs. The pericardial sac surrounds the heart. And this is like a CT scan or transverse cut sort of going right there, so you can see the lungs with the heart, with the thoracic vertebrae. Okay, so this is from a cadaver, so this is a real heart. You'll see there's actually in the epicardium, so the outer part of the whole pericardial sac that surrounds the heart, there's a lot of fat. There's a lot of fat surrounding the heart. You'll be surprised to see this. When we look at the hearts, we're going to dissect hearts, and there's a whole bunch of fat in that epicardium that you can see, kind of all surrounding the heart. So insulating and sort of protecting. Here's the apex. Here's sort of sitting on the base. Here's the aorta. It's the biggest blood vessel in the body. Comes straight out of the top of the heart. Superior vena cava coming from the neck and the head. Here's the trachea. And then this whole area is the mediastinum, sort of right in this cavity right here. Okay, pericardium that surrounds the heart, it has 2 layers. And this is to protect and sort of encase the heart within that mediastinum. It's got the fibrous pericardium. It's a dense connective tissue, okay? And then it's got the serous pericardium. So the pericardium has this tough, fibrous outer part, and then it's got the serous pericardium, which is made up of 2 little layers, and we talked about these earlier. These are the serosal layers. These epithelial, thin, sheet-like, I describe them sort of as like Ziploc baggies, kind of like, right? Just surrounding the organs, and they're kind of delicate. So you got the fibrous pericardium and the serous pericardium. So this one is made of the parietal layer and the visceral layer of the serous pericardium, right? So remember the visceral layer, which one we talked about serosal membranes, where's the visceral layer with respect to the organ? Remember? Right next to it, that's right. Think of visceral guts, it's right up against it. So it's the thin membrane that's right up against the heart, the visceral layer. And then the parietal layer is the second layer that's around that one, okay? And then around that whole thing is this tough fibrous pericardium, okay? So I want you to remember those. We talked about those in the beginning of the class, and now we come back to them here. So if we look at this outer part, we're looking at just a little outer wall. We're up in the left atrium right now. And then we look at the structure of this whole pericardium that surrounds the heart. We've got the fibrous pericardium, and then we've got this parietal layer of the serosal membranes, and the visceral layer of the serosal membranes. And the other names for these, a lot of people call this is the epicardium. Okay, so it's just directly surrounding the heart. It's really tight right up against the muscle of the heart. And then the pericardial cavity, so there's that gap or that potential kind of fluid-filled space that's between the two. And then the parietal layer is squished up right against the fibrous pericardium. All of this is the pericardial sac that surrounds the entire heart. So you have to sort of cut through it and cut it open so that you can actually see the heart. The myocardium is the muscle that makes up the walls of the heart and the chambers of the heart. The endocardium is a thin endothelial layer, very simple cells like simple squamous cells that are just lining the inner cavities of the entire heart. So all of this makes up the heart wall. This is the pericardium that surrounds the heart itself. Is there a question? No? Are we good? Okay. No mice or anything? Okay, stretch. Just now in here, we're going to have a mouse or something random happen. All right, so all those layers. Epicardium is made of the visceral layer of the serous pericardium, as we call the epicardium, epi, right above the heart. And then the myocardium, all the muscle of the heart arranged in circular and spiral patterns. So circular and spiral patterns in that the muscle goes around and spirals around, circles around the atria and the ventricles. So it's arranged in these spiral patterns. The endocardium, like I mentioned, is the endothelial layer, basically simple squamous cells resting on a layer of connective tissue, protein, and it lines the internal walls of the heart. So it's all lining, really thin lining of the internal aspect of the heart. The spiral and circular muscle bands of the myocardium are interesting because that's how they form during embryonic development. They take on that unique shape where they sort of make a circular arrangement around the atria, and then they spiral down around the ventricles. They're positioned that way so that the heart can act like almost like a bellow, like it's getting wrung out. So it squeezes the top and then it squeezes the bottom. And it squeezes the top and squeezes the bottom. So it helps in the muscular dual pumping action of the heart. All right, so the chambers we're going to go through. I want to keep this straight though, because sometimes these get confusing. For me, I know I can switch them. Like if we have the chambers, we have the upper chambers, and then we have the sort of lower chambers. When you're looking at this, whenever you see hearts that are diagrammed or actual hearts or pictures, it's almost always in anatomical position unless it's said otherwise. which means it's a person looking at you, which means it's someone else's heart with them facing you. So this right here would be what? Yes. So for me, when I look at this, I always just have to switch it. I have to go, okay, that's my right, so it's the heart's left. Or I do a weird thing where I turn around like that in my mind. I go, oh yeah, okay. And then, so that's the right atrium. So then that's the right ventricle, and that's the left ventricle, okay? So it's, you have to kind of keep that straight. Even when you're dissecting hearts in lab, we'll do that not next week, but the following week. You have to kind of look at it and always remember, right? Your right is the left on the heart and vice versa, okay? So it's got right and left atria, right and left ventricles, internal divisions that separate the heart, I want you to know. And we're going to make little cuts in certain positions around these. The interventricular septum and the interatrial septum. Septa is when there's multiple, right? You're talking about all of them together. Septum, this is the interventricular septum. So it's the separation between those two. And this is the interatrial septum. Okay, so separating the right and left halves are chambers of the heart. There's also external markings on the heart. There's a coronary sulcus. Okay, what is a sulcus or sulci? Remember gyri and sulci we talked about in the brain? Remember that? Yes, the folds. But what are the sulci? So gyri are the folds, the part that stick up, protrude. And then what are the sulci? The grooves, right. The grooves, the indentions that we can actually see, okay? So there's a coronary sulcus. It's a groove, like a canal sort of, a grooves down that goes down the front of the heart. There's an anterior interventricular sulcus. So that kind of goes right down where that interventricular septum is. And then there's a posterior interventricular sulcus that goes down the back side of the posterior side of the heart. Okay, so if we look at this, we've got this going through the sulcus, actually, where that groove is, we have arteries. So there's the anterior interventricular artery. It's in the sulcus. It goes right through the sulcus. This is a lot of fat sort of surrounding the actual heart on the epicardium, and we'll look at that. And there is a left coronary artery. So it's in the coronary sulcus. It's right in here, and it comes from the left. These are coming from the aorta, actually. They go, and then they go down the front side, left side of the heart through the coronary sulcus, and then down through the anterior interventricular sulcus. And then the same with this. There's a right coronary artery in the coronary sulcus. And this is, again, coming from the aorta. Why are these important? These are landmarks, and when you look at the heart, you can see, okay, I'm at the front of the heart. I see it. It's got the, actually, there are little ear flaps, muscular ear flaps called auricles. Remember in the ear, we talked about the auricle, or the pinna. That's the flap of the ear, the part of the ear that sticks out. We have ear flaps or auricles that are sitting right on top of the atria. And then those coronary sulci, and then the anterior interventricular sulcus with the anterior interventricular artery, and then also vein that go right down that. So those are kind of landmarks that are in front of the heart. Why do we have those? Why does our heart have all these blood vessels, arteries, veins, capillaries? Why are all those here? Is the heart a living tissue? Right, so living tissue, these are cardiac muscle fibers and all kinds of other fibers sort of surrounding it. But directly the heart itself is mostly cardiac muscle fibers or myocardial fibers. They have to get oxygen and blood themselves. So the heart is pumping blood to the head and the body. It's also pumping that blood to itself. And actually that's how heart attacks or myocardial infarctions happen, when there's a clogging or blocking of one of these coronary arteries that prevents blood flow to the heart itself, and then the heart can't carry out its muscular pumping action as well, right? You have a damaged part, and so it messes up the cardiac cycle, and it can't get oxygen to itself. If you get a deficient pump or something happening with the pump, you can imagine now the efficiency of getting that blood out to the brain and the body, it's going to be compromised. All right, so if we look at the back surface, this is the inferior view. So sort of posterior part is over here, inferior is here because it's sitting on the diaphragm, tilted back. So this whole base right here, here's the apex. We're sitting on the base here. There's a coronary sinus. So again, there's coronary sinus a large kind of vein. And then there is posterior interventricular artery and vein that are going right through that posterior interventricular sulcus. And it kind of goes right along right here. You can see in this view all of the sort of major vessels that are entering and leaving the heart. And then the auricles, you can kind of see them from sitting from the back right there. So apex, base, again, there's a lot of fat surrounding. And then there's key veins and arteries that go especially in those landmarks we can see, like the sulcus, the two different sulci. All right, so the heart valves. So those are the overall coronary structures, outer part of the heart, the sulci and the arteries and veins that run through them. Those keep the heart healthy and happy and getting all the blood and oxygen it needs. So the heart not only pumps to all the other systems of the body, but it pumps to itself. Okay, so that's very important. So each valve, the endocardium has, with the connective tissue core, it has this endocardium, okay? So each valve is made up of this endocardium and connective tissue, so it's pretty tough. You've got the AV valves, or the atrioventricular valves, and those are between the atria and the ventricles, okay? So between, if we put that up, there's valves, and they separate the top chambers from the bottom chambers. Those valves with their little cusps are the AV valves. They're called the tricuspid and the bicuspid, and that is for how many cusps they have. One has 3 of those valve cusps, and one has 2, and we're going to look at those. And then we have another set of valves, and that's the aortic and pulmonary valves, okay? And these are semilunar valves. These go at the base of the major vessels, arteries, that are leaving the heart. So they're at the junction of the ventricles and the great arteries that are leaving. We call them the pulmonary and aortic semilunar valves, or SL valves. Semilunar because you'll see when we dissect the heart, when you cut right through in a nice, like a frontal cut, you can see right through there that the valves actually look like little half moons. They look like semi-lunar, like little half moon, crescent moon shapes, right in sort of that coronal cut. So AV valves have 3 cusps and 2, we'll look at those. And then the semilunars that are at the base of the pulmonary artery and the base of the aortic artery, those are called the semilunar valves. Okay, so now we'll go in and we'll sort of name these different vessels and what they are, what these different chambers are. I have a blank one on your papers as well, or you can just write it out as we do it. What is that chamber right there? Okay, and we'll just write. And let's see. Let's go over to the other one, this one. Okay. This space right here. This space over here. Right ventricle, yeah. Okay, now we've got valves that separate